The superficiality, triviality and short-term expediency of Western elites. Bruce Charlton. Yesterday I listened to a video in which political commenters Gonzalo Lira and Alexander Mercouris were discussing the Western elites, i.e. the leadership class, and how they had declined, across about half a century, to the current very low level of superficiality and short-termism. GL and AM were not able to link this symptom to its spiritual roots, although they did sense that the phenomenon was due to the Western leaders, actually being not true leaders but puppets of globalists, whose loyalty was to these globalists rather than to their nations. I.e. Western leaders are in truth merely middle managers, in a worldwide bureaucracy of which the masses are ignorant of the identities of the genuine leaders. Their middle mongrel role is, indeed, evident in the personalities and, capabilities of Western national leaders. But GL and AM did a good job of describing those symptoms, and others, such a total incapacity even to understand other worldviews, instead projecting their own extremely cynical selfishness onto everyone else, such that genuine patriotism, religiousness, and long-termism are utterly invisible, their dishonesty, and their complete absence of any vision or purpose for their societies. The division of the world nations that has been triggered by the Fire Nation War has revealed that this collapse of leadership is a mostly Western phenomenon. AM described the stark difference in attitudes and priorities between the two sides of the recent international divide that is evident nowadays, whenever world leaders gather to meet and plan. He says that the disgust and disdain of the non-Western leaders for the trivial showbiz antics of their Western equivalents is plain, and increasing. What GL and AM both miss, as I said, is that the problem goes much deeper than incompetence, lack of empathy and covertly misplaced loyalties, and deeper also than the corruption of the Western mass populations. The problem is that the Western elites serve powers that are, or are themselves, actively evil. They are not merely misguided, insensible and self-deceiving, leading unintentionally to bad outcomes. Instead, the Western elites actually desire and seek bad outcomes. Many among the elite desire to make the whole world a totalitarian uni-state of omni-surveillance and micro-controlled behavior and thinking. And increasing numbers of them are personally motivated by sheerly destructive spite directed against their ever-expanding list of enemies. Indeed, the elite morality, such as it is an inversion of reality and truth. They want a world of lies, ugliness and sin, of mass suffering, fear, resentment and despair, i.e. they want this for others. Thus even astute and critical secular analysts such as GL and, especially, AM, are actually blind to the most important things in the world, in the sense that they sense the surface ripples, but are unable to identify the deep currents that cause them. Because the currents that drive material change in the world, globally, nationally, locally, personally, are themselves spiritual in their origins and purposes. Note added, I should make clear that, so far as I can tell, all of the nations of the world are on the same downward path towards the agenda of evil, but at different rates, and some nations are much further along that path than others. During this past calendar year, there has apparently been a small but significant and hopeful reversal of downsliding in the Fire Nation. This is due to 3 decades, and continuing, of Orthodox Christian revival, bringing movement towards the earlier Byzantine polity aimed at harmony and integration between state and church. If so, this process has a long way to go before a stable, top-down, Christianly led social structure is achieved. If indeed such an atavistic restoration is possible, given the evolutionary development of man's consciousness towards individuality of agency and personal responsibility for salvation and theosis. Such a reversal toward medieval structures is not possible in the West, I am sure. We surely need to embrace romantic Christianity and aim at final participation, if we are to avoid mass spiritual damnation. However, it may be that other peoples have a different destiny. Why lack of agency is so commonly claimed in this modern world? Bruce Charlton. It strikes me that, whether explicitly or implicitly, people are very keen to project and claim for themselves a lack of agency. In other words, people are very keen to explain human behavior in terms that assume it is a consequence of environment, that human evaluations and choices have an insignificant role in determining behavior. That environment determines behavior, or, in other words, nurture is primary, nature is malleable, and men are, in effect, blank slates upon which society inscribes. On the face of it, it is a remarkable thing that so many people use their agency to deny agency, whether in themselves or in others. But there are many possible reasons for this, although perhaps, as I shall explain below, these all reduce to a single reason. For example, people often claim lack of agency for themselves when they wish to avoid responsibility and blame. And they do much the same when they wish to absolve some favored group, a victim group, from blame. This is why people so often claim to be powerless, discriminated against, excluded. They are claiming that they have no choice but to do whatever they are caused to do, and therefore cannot be blamed for it. Thus they claim that the effective answer to this particular problem is that I, or my favored group, ought to be better treated. Such people, or groups, are, in effect, asking to be rescued from a situation that they did not choose, and cannot escape from. They are like sentient cattle who are starving and miserable, crying out for a kind farmer to drive them to another, and better, pasture. Elites, however, tend to claim agency for themselves, at least, up to a point, while denying it in the masses whom they seek to control. This, indeed, is the implicit basis for elite legitimacy, and the reason why they claim the right to control others/us. The idea is that we cannot understand or make wise choices, because we are passive creatures who behave automatically as a consequence of incentive and sanctions. Whereas the elites stand above this, outside of the determining causes, elites therefore make up their own minds, achieve understanding and make choices, and therefore have the authority to shape society for its own good, because mass society cannot do this for themselves, lacking agency. Society is thus divided into the controllers and the responders, those who stand outside the societal causes and those who are trapped within them. In other words, since the masses cannot decide for themselves, because they lack agency, then those who do have agency must necessarily do the deciding for them. The only question then is who, among those agent elites, ought to do this deciding? And this is where elections come in. Elections assume that there must be controllers, and, since they are devised, administered and interpreted by the elites, elections comprise the various arrangements by which the elites determine who, among themselves, gets to do the controlling. The mass/electors regard themselves as have just enough agency to be sufficient to pick their favorite controller among the elites. Election voting is done to choose who gets to shape my behavior. Behind these various claims of lack of agency is the desire for a better world, in a godless and spiritualized universe. In a strange and paradoxical way, the claimed lack of agency of many or most people, is the only way that hope for betterment can be found, in a world where all meaning is understood to be manufactured by men. If everyone was happy and hopeful, then they would take responsibility for their choices, but the pervasive dissatisfaction and alienation of modern societies means that people seek life satisfaction in social arrangements. For there to be a good society actually requires that men are passive products of society. That is, for there to be a better world entails that men must be shaped by society, and thus men must lack agency. I think we can see that the, apparently absurdly irrational, structuring but implicit ideology of the world in 2022, is a consequence of a deep yearning for a better world. That is, a world better in a material sense, a world where everybody might be happy and nobody suffers. For this to happen, absolutely requires that men are passive responders. And, for such a world to be the object of hope, it requires that there be some men who are active controllers, who have agency and take responsibility, including blame, and who stand outside of the environmental networks of incentives and sanctions that cause the behavior of everyone else, the passive masses. The passive masses therefore create and sustain the elites as repositories of existential hope, and typically regard the elites as a contested zone, an arena of conflict between the good agents, who are trying to make a better world for us masses, and the bad elites who are trying to use the masses for their own satisfaction. This explains the partisan nature of politics, and the experience-proof fashion in which the masses recurrently invest hope in elite-led salvation. If the claim of lacking agency is indeed central to most people's hopes for a better world, then we can see why the more cynical idea that the elites are not really partisan but all one, that elites are essentially and overall a collusion not a competition, is a thing that people can adjust to, albeit it is resisted strongly, and partisanship is still normal. The masses can cope with the idea that elites are short-termist and selfish so long as the elites are also regarded as lacking agency. This seems to be the case in our advanced, indigeneracy, democracy. The elites increasingly demand victim status and deny their own agency. And this is broadly accepted, because, in principle, it might be possible to set up a system of incentives and sanctions that include the elite. Such a system would then impose long-termist and altruistic goals on the elites, as well as the masses, who, lacking agency, would be bound to follow them. And, once set up, a totally embracing system that rewarded long-termism and altruism might be expected to be self-sustaining. Some such notion is at the heart of most of the ideologies of the past century plus. The idea that a better world is a consequence of a better system. And for a better system to do its job, men must lack agency. The only problem, albeit it is a huge one, is how to get from here to there, from our current condition, to one in which the system makes men good. When there is no faith in men, all faith is in the system. Only if the system is good, can men be made good. Therefore, if there is to be a better world, everything else than the system, including men, can and must be sacrificed to the making and sustaining of the good system. Totalitarianism is the envisaged method. How to get from here to there, from where we are to the good system, is a problem. But what a path, the method must surely be via totalitarianism, which is why totalitarianism is so widely embraced and supported in the world today, as being a step in the right direction. Since hope is invested in a single good system, then whatever the answer it must be totalitarianism. That there will be one, global, and all-powerful system is a given requirement. The only legitimate debate concerns the specific content of that system. Such is the nature and scope of debate among today's globalist elites. The one thing that cannot be tolerated by the masses is if the elites are regarded as 1. Essentially collusive rather than competitive, 2. Possessing agency, and 3. Also, by choice, from that agency, fundamentally evil in motivation. In a God-denying and anti-spiritual secular society, such an insight would destroy human hope, and lead to despair. Unfortunately, this seems to be exactly what is true. There is a broadly cohesive elite, with agency, and they have, overwhelmingly, chosen to serve the goals of evil. But that situation is exactly the one that cannot be acknowledged without inescapable despair, unless, that is, men first recognize God and the primarily spiritual nature of this reality. Note, in 1934 T.S. Eliot wrote, "They constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good." Consciousness and Christ. William Wildblood. According to standard esoteric teachings, human souls come to this earth to evolve their consciousness, this being the perfect environment in which to do that given the sense of separation to be found here. It's somewhat like a child being turfed out of the secure family home where everything is done for it in order to make its own way in the world and as a result become a mature, responsible adult able to engage with life creatively and actually contribute to the world in a positive manner. These teachings assume reincarnation and say we come back here many times, seeking experience and means of expression to grow as souls. This is linked to the doctrine of reaping what you sow, with the consequence that everything we do, and possibly even think, sets up a flow of psychic energy which we must deal with. It may manifest materially as external circumstances and conditions or internally as character traits, but we are responsible for all that we are. This is not to punish but to teach. We evolve in this way until we are able to raise our consciousness to the spiritual level while in an earthly body. It's more complicated than that, but this is the in a nutshell version. Sometimes these teachings picture us as similar to cells in the body of a greater being, which would be the spirit that stands behind our sun. This being or solar logos is also evolving and would be part of a galactic being who, in turn, would form part of the being who stands behind the whole universe, who would, I suppose, be God. There is a pleasing symmetrical order to this scenario and it makes sense on an intellectual level. I believe it to be broadly speaking correct, with the solar and stellar spirits as something like great archangels and so on upwards. There is a problem with this vision though. It doesn't really fit in with Christian teaching. Esotericists realize this and, as a result, tend to jettison Christianity, reducing Christ to a great spiritual teacher or head of a spiritual hierarchy that oversees humanity, or else picture him as the solar logos and say this was what was meant by Son of God. You can absorb most other spiritual approaches into this one, which is what its partisans generally do, but you cannot really absorb Christ, not without making him something other than what he said he was, or altering his teachings to mean something other than what he says they meant. Christ didn't talk about evolving consciousness and he was not inclusive. He said he, underlined, was the way, the truth and the life. That is unequivocal. He is not part of some all-purpose spirituality but goes beyond mere spirituality to something higher, deeper and truer, something approaching proper holiness. Christ taught that we should love God whom we could see revealed in him. This is extreme to say the least, but it is what he taught, and if we believe in Christ we must believe that. Is it possible to reconcile these two teachings? Many people don't bother. They believe one or the other, but I find myself in the tricky position of believing both. I do believe that human souls are supposed to be evolving their consciousness, and this earth serves as the background for that, a kind of playpen in which we can build things, though what we are really building is ourselves. But I also believe that Christ goes beyond that. This means that spirituality and evolving consciousness is one thing but Christ is another. He comes to the worldly and the spiritual alike and offers them both something more. The spiritual may be further along the path to God as things stand, but the wonder of Christ is that anyone can come to him from any background and is accepted by him if they give themselves heart and soul to him, and this acceptance will transform their soul to a higher degree than any self-pursued spirituality can ever do. You may be building a humble village church or a grand cathedral, but both are hollow structures without the light of Christ illumining them from within. Could it be that before the advent of Christ scenario 1 operated, human souls reincarnated after a period in the spiritual realms to further their spiritual evolution, and this proceeded in a certain direction, developing all aspects of the whole being, unless brought to a close by the attainment of Buddhist nirvana, meaning a complete disidentification with the phenomenal world and, in a sense, rejection of creation. But Christ came to bring a higher understanding, one in which the soul could be made like him by allowing him into itself. Any soul on any evolutionary level could do this, though naturally the more developed the soul, the more of Christ it could absorb and express. Thus, the path of spiritual evolution exists, and so does the path of Christ, but this latter brings more of divine reality to the picture. For instance, an evolving soul might, in esoteric parlance, have opened all its psychic energy centers, including that at the crown of the head, but unless it has fully accepted Christ, it is still operating in the spiritual world rather than the true heaven of Christ, which is a new creation containing more of divine being than can ever be attained just through evolution. I realize a lot more has to be done if one is to develop a proper understanding of how Christ impacts and goes beyond standard issue spirituality, but this is my attempt at a start. Why hasn't civilization collapsed already? Or, what is the source of negentropy? Bruce Charlton. While I realize that civilization could begin to accelerate irreversibly into collapse today, tomorrow, or next week, the fact that this has not already happened is more and more astonishing, because essentially every single policy change in the Western world has been destructive for the past 3 or more decades. Entropy rules, the trend is against creation and towards disorder. If you doubt this, take a look at the mainstream media and the major stories it is pushing on any given day, including the major narrative, fictions, images, concepts, and facts, and, assuming you can interpret things from a Christian basis, you will be forced to agree. Every week, the powers that should not be seen to unveil another body blow against civilization, piling in another upon another. The astonishing thing is that civilization has not yet collapsed. I mean, this is really astonishing. On the one side, we have the entirety of the global, national and local leadership class, and the leadership of all the major corporations, professions, and, supposedly, functional social institutions, all of whom are doing their level best to destroy their own functionality and destroy what remains. Why have they not yet succeeded? Why has entropy not been able to succeed in reducing civilization to chaos? What is that which opposes entropy? What is, in other words, the source of negentropy in Western civilization? I regard this as a genuine mystery, at least at the material level. Looked at materially, we have most of the world functioning entirely on smoke and mirrors, on lies and delusions. And yet, here we are. My best guess is that, although the system is corrupt, i.e. does not aim at functionality, aims primarily at anti-functional leftist goals, most of the system is useless or harmful. Therefore, damaging functionality makes no real difference, or may have a mildly positive effect. Even within valuable systems, the necessary work is done by relatively few people, in minority sectors of the overall institution. So long as these continue to perform their jobs, then things can keep going for the time being. Of course, by this material analysis, in the end they will win, civilization will collapse substantially, and billions will die, unless the trend to destruction and increased entropy is reversed. Because the way things are going, the functional aspect of civilization is shrinking towards the point that it cannot be sustained, no matter how effective are the minority of real workers and doers. Yet this analysis does not account for why the minority of the functional workforce are motivated to keep doing what needs to be done, in a world where everything official, bureaucratic and of media origin, literally, conspires against them. When all the incentives are for more entropy, who is opposing it? Who is behaving negentropically? What makes this situation even stranger is that I strongly suspect that most of those few who do the world's work are not aware of any compelling reason why they should do so, they just do it. Farmers, maintenance engineers, repairmen. These are not usually self-consciously aware of the distinctive reasons behind the fact that they maintain an ideal of functionality in a world where the mass majority are indifferent or actively hostile to it. My best answer, so far, is that these are still operating instinctually, unconsciously, with a residue of that original participation that used to be almost universal and which once coordinated communities and societies. They, perhaps, do not, like most people, feel themselves to be wholly alienated individuals, essentially detached from other men, and from the world and nature. Because they experience themselves, implicitly, as part of life, they continue to fulfill their roles in the scheme, regardless of incentives. If so, this cannot last. The irreversible trend for several generations of adults has been a dwindling to extinction of such unconscious, instinctive communality and service. We therefore cannot rely upon the dwindling stocks of real workers to sustain civilization. In the first place, they will not be allowed to, the target is painted on them, and the missiles are flying. Just consider how quickly the ethos of courageous service in a good cause has been crushed in the US and UK police or military, where it is now essentially illegal to be a good cop/soldier, just as, much earlier, it was made impossible to be a good scientist or a good teacher. The only sustainable positive development will be for individuals to become aware of the needs of the community, and the powers of evil that work to crush it. And then, in face of this, such people will need to make a conscious choice to know and repudiate evil, and instead seek good, so far as they are able. The age of unconscious, automatic, common-sense goodness is past, and unless people come to recognize purposive evil explicitly, to discern the root of good in God, and to ally with God and divine creation, then evil will be unopposed, and entropy will lead to chaos. Planet Narnia by Michael Ward, 2010, and My Reflections on C.S. Lewis's Medieval Christianity. Bruce Charlton. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in primary school, perhaps after watching a dramatized version on television, then The Silver Chair, but did not read any other of the Narnia Chronicles as a child. Indeed, I did not read them until the past decade, after I had become a Christian, and I came to the books via Brian Sibley's superb BBC radio dramatizations. Yes, despite this very delayed, and rather gradual, path to appreciation, I now recognize the Narnia books as among the very best of their kind, and I return to reread, and/or re-listen, over and again, and have read several books of scholarship and analysis about them. Of these, Planet Narnia stands out as the most impressive and memorable, not just for its insights into the world of Narnia, but also because it contains a great deal of absolutely fascinating and valuable information on the medieval worldview, in particular the astrological cosmology. Planet Narnia puts forward the interpretative key that each of the 7 Narnia books is presided over and permeated by one of the 7 medieval planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. I found Ward's evidence and argument completely convincing, which means that this is a remarkable and rare example of literary criticism, in exposing a major aspect of a major author's major work, that had been, apparently, completely hidden and undiscovered for more than half a century. I read the book a couple of years after it was published, and have just been re-listening to the audio version, and am impressed anew at the detail and thoroughness with which PN is argued. But this time of reading, my own understanding of Christianity has moved far away from that of Lewis, which was, pretty much, where it began, since Lewis was very important in my own conversion. Now, I find myself somewhat amazed, and rather appalled, at the complexity and subtlety of C.S. Lewis's style of Christianity, both his personal faith and his public apologetics and devotional work. Lewis has long had the reputation of being a plain speaker and tough arguer, yet his discussions of Christianity, of the nature of God, the nature and mission of Christ, the nature of virtue and sin, and so forth, seems to demand quite extraordinary powers of concentration, memory, and contextual scholarship. Now, my feeling is, this cannot be right. It, surely, cannot be necessary. It, surely, cannot be that the religion, shall we call it, founded by Jesus would really be such as to need such an apparatus of specific expertise and authority, given that God created this varied and changing world, and a multitude of extremely different individual people living in a very wide range of social circumstances. Lewis does as good a job as anyone of explaining the inexplicable aspects of traditional Christianity, but I now feel sure that the inexplicable aspects are the consequence of human misinterpretation, not a part of God's plan or Jesus' ministry. In other words, the explanations do not really explain, they merely kick the can, when they ought to be challenging the premises. Like explaining my evil by Adam's transgression, or Adam's evil by the devil, or blaming the devil's evil on his prideful rejection of God. None of these displacements get any closer to explaining how there is any evil at all in a creation made by a wholly good God, if that God is also assumed to have made everything from nothing and been omnipotent. The simple answer is that God is not omnipotent, whatever that really means, and Jesus never said he was. Indeed, Christianity depends on God not being omnipotent. Or, Lewis does as good a job as anyone of the explaining how Christ is both God and man, when God is regarded as both wholly transcendent and wholly immanent. Or how God lives out of time and knows all that happened and will happen, yet man lives in time, and has free agency. Or how God is both a monotheistic unity, and also divided into three persons. But in the end, these are just hypnotic word webs that are attempting to enable belief in inherited incompatible doctrines. But how is it that incompatible doctrines were not a problem for so many centuries? Lewis himself shows us the reason, and why what once worked as Christian belief, no longer works. C.S. Lewis was indeed, as he claimed to be, a dinosaur, the last of the medieval minds. He was a man whose mind was essentially medieval, which, by my understanding, was a transitional mind between the prehistoric almost unconscious and immersive simplicities of animism, and modern alienated individuality. This middle consciousness has both elements of ancient unconscious participation and also, to an exceptionally high degree, more than modern man, the abstracting and intellectualizing tendency. It is, indeed, the automatic and instinctual spirituality, mysticism and supernaturalism of a mind like C.S. Lewis's, that enables him to embrace such logically rigorous complexities of theology, without destroying his faith. It was because Lewis, like the medievals, had a foot in the ancient animistic world of a universe of beings, that he was able wholeheartedly to embrace a faith rooted in abstract reasoning. One foot in the past, the other in modernity, his mind's instinctual unconscious irrationality was strongly operative, even when he was using cold logic, discussing detached attributes and aspects, or deploying reductionistic, analytic modeling of reality. We modern men find that abstraction and intellectuality deaden and demotivate, and then they become dishonest. Lacking such a foot in the past and the consequent prior motivational truthfulness, then rigor dissolves into expediency, as we see with the near-total corruption of science over recent decades. Instead of combining unconscious rootedness with explicit rigor, modern man oscillates between incoherent, vacillating emotions, and lying, manipulative modeling. We have inherited much the same, and incoherent, off-centered, doctrines of Christianity as in Lewis's day, but have lost our roots in spontaneous tradition and common sense. Typical, representative, modern man is severely innerly demotivated, such that he cannot resist the short-term expedient. But those who recognize the unsatisfactoriness of the typical mainstream modern condition no longer have the Lewisian possibility of sustaining a serious and motivating medieval consciousness. Such is Lewis's charisma, and our gratitude to him for his unequaled success as a Christian apologist in modern times, that there is a danger in trying to emulate his faith and its basis. However, emulation is not possible. We, now, are fundamentally different consciousnesses from Lewis, and to attempt to replicate Lewis is merely to mimic. And, de facto, mimicry is grossly insufficient as a basis for Christian living in these end times. So we can learn a great deal from C.S. Lewis, but should not try to replicate and sustain his theology. Many of those who tried to sustain Lewis's specific metaphysical and theological ideas, and his lifestyle advice, have, so far as I can tell, failed the litmus test issues of our time. That is, rigorous, high-status, Lewis scholars and disciples often have converged with mainstream totalitarian leftism, and thereby, overall, joined sides with the powers of evil and against God. In other words, one can be a devoted Lewisite, and live as a Lewisite Christian, yet be an enemy of Christ. So far, so depressing. Yet this disastrous, albeit covered, mass apostasy has a positive aspect. If we can recognize that someone can adhere to the letter of C.S. Lewis's theology and doctrines, and the same applies for all other theologies and doctrines, yet not be a real Christian, this implies an opposite, that real Christianity is separable from metaphysics, theology and doctrine. If we can recognize that being a real Christian has independence from Lewis's specific metaphysics, theology and all the rest of it, and at the same time can recognize that the Narnia Chronicles are imaginatively permeated with a real, various and rich Christian spirit, then maybe the path is clear to understanding what it is to be a real Christian independently of the classical and traditional structures that came to us via the Middle Ages. The path is open to a romantic Christianity that motivates us to adhere to the side of God and the commitment to follow Jesus Christ through the pressures and corruptions of these end times, while also recognizing a common real Christianity, and the possibility of genuinely Christian alliance, across many denominations and churches. Explaining away leadership, the bureaucratic mind at work. Bruce Charlton. It has been interesting to sample the journalistic and professional commentary about Ben Stokes's captaincy leadership of the England Test match cricket team, about which I recently wrote as being a current example of a great leader. In all examples I have seen, the analysis has explained Stokes's success in terms of the application a new set of rules or principles, probably devised from the previous experience of the coach McCullum, when he was captain of New Zealand. In other words, Stokes is envisaged as implementing something akin to bullet points from a managerial strategy document. At the end of the day, the leader is envisaged as a kind of frontman or actor, whose talent is to be a plausible and inspiring advocate of a prior blueprint for successful, or, at least entertaining, cricket. But this is not to explain leadership, but to explain it away. The origin of leadership is, in these analyses, understood as being located outside of the leader, elsewhere from the leader himself. This is arguing from implicit, mostly unconscious, assumptions that, in effect, bureaucracy is the true reality, and the source of social functionality, and leaders are just a specialized group of functionaries, whose essence is to perform a designated role. I am aware that this argument is analogous to Max Weber's division of authority between charismatic, legal, i.e. bureaucratic, and traditional, but the concept of authority is not identical with leadership. What I am saying is very simple. When there is real leadership, it primarily comes from the leader, is located in the leader. And when, secondarily, the effects of leadership are analyzed into components, rules, principles, objectives etc., then we are not talking about leadership, but instead something more like authority. Leadership is given, but authority can be manufactured, e.g. by the power to reward or sanction. Leadership is originative, generative, creative. But authority need not be, and often is the opposite. Leadership is therefore akin to creative genius, but not identical with it, since the basis is different. Creative genius requires high intelligence and a long-term, inwardly motivated endogenous personality, the ability to work at some particular thing for long periods of intense and with sustained focus. But great leaders, such as Stokes, need not be especially intelligent, he isn't, and are often exceptionally simple in terms of explicit long-term strategy, and instinctive, here-and-now responsive, in terms of tactics. Leadership is relational, it happens in a social context, while genius is focused on the transcendentals, truth, beauty, virtue. I therefore regard leadership as a category of its own, and not a subdivision of other systems or attributes. Leadership is found in individual persons, or perhaps, with less stability, a duo, but never in committees or other groups, never as part of a system. And leadership, again like creative genius, can accomplish things that cannot otherwise be achieved. I repeat, cannot otherwise be achieved. Cannot means cannot. Therefore, without leadership, options are limited and circumscribed, when compared with what may be possible when leadership is a factor. Barfield misunderstanding Barfield. Bruce Charlton. One of the difficulties about understanding Owen Barfield is that he did not really understand himself. I mean that Barfield did not really understand the nature of his own philosophical work, and thereby said some misleading things about it. Barfield's major work was Saving the Appearances, and in his introduction to the 1988 edition of this book, which are Barfield's first published, and Framing, words in the reprinted editions since then, Barfield tries to provide a helpful framework to avoid what he terms a misunderstanding, and a difficulty. What Barfield regards as the misunderstanding is that some readers have treating the work as claiming to provide a complete metaphysical theory of the nature of reality. Not so. Leaving aside the weasel word complete, because nothing finite ever is complete. But of course Barfield is exactly providing a metaphysical theory of reality. Metaphysics is that philosophy which deals in the fundamental nature of reality, and Barfield is claiming in star that reality is inextricably consequential of both chaos and consciousness, because chaos is meaningless and unknowable without consciousness. Also, Barfield asserts that consciousness has changed through time, and therefore, says Barfield, reality itself, and not just perception of reality, has changed through time, nature itself, has changed in the course of time in a mode not covered by the doctrines of biological evolution. Furthermore, without consciousness, says Barfield, there is no knowable reality, only chaos. So that from Barfield's assumptions, it is incoherent to theorize about a world without consciousness. Thus, a cosmology which, like both Big Bang and steady-state theories, speculates on the formation of a non-alive universe in the absence of consciousness is not so much mistaken as simply incoherent, as are similar speculations on the formation and evolution of an inorganic Earth before the advent of life. Barfield's, drawing heavily upon Rudolf Steiner's, albeit not identical with Steiner, is indeed a fundamentally different understanding of reality than anything in the Western or Eastern mainstream of philosophy or theology. Therefore, whether Barfield acknowledges it or not, in star he is indeed doing metaphysics, and proposing a particular metaphysical description. Barfield claims he tried to preserve neutrality towards all such metaphysical speculations by referring to objective reality, that is to say, reality insofar as it is independent of our awareness of it, sometimes as the particles and sometimes as the unrepresented. But this is not neutrality, because neutrality in metaphysics is impossible. Barfield's conceptualization of objective as unrepresented/particles is itself a metaphysical division and definition. Barfield then says, the subject of this book is not the nature of reality, it is the evolution of consciousness. This translates as Barfield saying he is not doing metaphysics, but is, implicitly, doing a kind of science that he claims to be independent of, neutral about, metaphysical assumptions. So, Barfield's detailed account of the way that word meanings have changed through human history, is claimed to be, in effect, empirical and independent of metaphysical assumptions. But this is false, because Barfield's understanding of the implications of meaning change being located in consciousness, and consciousness being inextricably a part of reality, are excluded by the implicit and unconscious metaphysics of mainstream linguistic history. The changes of word meaning through history are interpreted using a very different and incommensurable significance than that which Barfield proposes, and the mainstream linguists would regard Barfield's interpretation as bizarre and obvious nonsense. Likewise, astro- and geophysicists would regard Barfield's assertion that their theories of the formation of the universe and of Earth were incoherent, because excluding any observing consciousness from such theories, to be absurd nonsense. Such physicists would almost certainly assert that their theories work empirically, have been cross-checked by multiple mathematical analyses and physical observations, and that there is just no problem. The difference between Barfield and the physicists is precisely metaphysics. Each is arguing from different basic assumptions concerning the nature of reality. My understanding of Barfield is that he was just plain wrong about what he was doing, just as Rudolf Steiner was wrong in the philosophy of freedom. Barfield claimed to be doing science and Steiner claimed to be doing epistemology, but in fact both were doing metaphysics. Both were, in these works, putting forward a different way of describing ultimate reality from that which was mainstream. This wrongness had an unfortunate effect in terms of obscuring the reader's understanding, because a convinced reader is given the false impression that Barfield and Steiner have proved their arguments in a neutral fashion, which ought to be universally acceptable, rather than having provided a radically different framework for the structuring of arguments. Furthermore, by failing to notice that they themselves are doing metaphysics, Barfield and Steiner both leave out God as a primary explanation for their understandings of reality. I have said before that it would be much easier for the reader to understand saving the experiences if Barfield had set out at the beginning that the evolution of consciousness which Barfield describes is a divine plan, which aims at the incremental divinization of man towards the level of God as creator. Lacking this structuring and explanatory reference to God, Barfield's attempted neutral description of the evolution of consciousness sounds like he is proposing a kind of law of nature, a biological principle that sounds like a rival theory of the same kind as mainstream biological evolution by natural selection. I believe the consequences of this confusion can be seen in most of mainstream Barfield scholarship since the 1960s. And this has been exacerbated by a failure to engage with the work of Rudolf Steiner. Yet, if we begin by stating Barfield's metaphysical assumptions as such, including the presence and role of God, it really is not difficult to understand, because then its validity does not hinge on understanding and following complex, multi-step arguments or evidence. Don't fear the night. Francis Berger. The spiritual foundations of the world have been obscured, its temporal forces exhausted. Modern history is ending. The sun is setting, the twilight is already here. Night will soon fall. After it does, hearkening back upon sunny days of the past will prove fruitless. Night does not beckon us to look outside but within. The night is deeper, true, but these depths must not be feared. In the depths there is time and space to connect with life, concentrate on the spirit, and work through the internal challenges and joys of existence. The night is a time for accumulating the faith, energy, strength, and love needed to create a new day. The new day will not simply arrive, it will not be given. It must be created. Only after this new creation will the night withdraw. How culpable is ignorance, aka accepting mainstream misinformation, on litmus test issues? Bruce Charlton. It is normal for most people to have strong convictions concerning issues about which they have passively absorbed these convictions entirely from the mainstream media and officialdom. For instance, the most recent of the major, world agenda-shaping litmus test issues of 2022 has been the Fire Nation vs. Evil Empire proxy war. Most people in my corner of the world have aggressively/sentimentally adopted a stance 100% in line with that propagated by the Western establishment, and are both completely ignorant of the causes of this conflict, and completely wrong about the Fire Nation's motivation and conduct. How culpable are such people for having chosen to support the side of evil in this great conflict of our time? There are various views on this matter. One is that people are not to blame, because all their information and analysis, whether from TV, newspapers, official announcements, or PR from large corporations, is consistent and internally coherent, at least, on a day-by-day basis, which is all that the masses ever notice. Such sources all confidently state the same things, often in the same words and with identical images, and provide evidence to support this conviction, while contrary information is not available, is indeed aggressively excluded. This would suggest that the support of the wrong side is simply mindless, non-responsible, and therefore innocent and not culpable, in much the way that young children are innocent and cannot be blamed for their expressed opinions on matters they take second-hand. This interpretation has it that the masses are closely analogous to young children in terms of innately trusting of authority. This is regarded as a fact of life, so that the masses are non-responsible for whatever authority tells them, and if the ignorant do preen themselves on their moral stances, and boast of their own goodness, then this is merely the forgivable bravado of a youngster obediently mimicking his elders. But such a view takes for granted that it is natural and reasonable for people passively to accept whatever view is propagated vigorously and monolithically by the establishment. That, in other words, here and now, in 2022, when Western authorities are unified in pushing a point of view, then it is a reasonable and morally innocent default to accept this point of view, and adopt the recommended attitudes. After all, it is said, in effect, we can hardly expect ordinary people to look behind the mass media official view, and each for himself discover that covert reality which so starkly contradicts the propagated fake narrative. Well, this matter of what we ought to expect from people, before adopting an opinion, is itself a thing that divides opinion. It has become accepted that it is okay for someone to spend, say, 2 hours a day marinating himself in official/mass media propaganda, plus another couple of hours reinforcing this on social media, yet never even for 5 minutes checking anything by looking at alternative sources, or even by 5 minutes of rigorous and critical thinking and remembering. Yet, by now it now seems clear that, whatever people ought to do in terms of checking, they will not do it. And it is therefore just so much wasted breath, or encore pixels, to assert that they should be doing it. Any complex or effort entailing answer to the problem of passive mind manipulation is therefore a non-starter. What, then, is the real crux of this matter? It is, simply, one's attitude to litmus test issues as such. When the world of officialdom, corporate propaganda and the mass/social media are pushing something, do we, as individuals, assume that this means what is being pushed is good and true? Or, do we, as individuals, assume the exact opposite, that the fact of such an onslaught of opinion and fact means that what is being pushed is instead an evil lie? And this crux decision, in turn, depends on our value discernment first about whether or not the dominant Western establishment institutions comprise a single and controlled system. Among those who recognize a controlled system, there is then the question of whether the system is net good, or is net evil. This matter of the system, then, is the big issue of the West in 2022, upon which all matters of public policy can be seen to hinge. The two questions are whether there is indeed such a system, and if there is a system, whether it is aiming at good. The decision about whether or not there is a system is decided by a person's prior assumptions as to whether it is possible that there could be a system. If it is pre-decided that there cannot be a system, and anyone who supposes there could be is a conspiracy theorist, then there cannot be a system, so it will not be recognized, regardless of evidence. If, instead, it is regarded as a real possibility that there might be a system, then the interpretation that there is indeed a system will instantly be obvious, because a vast and growing mass of supporting evidence will be clear and unambiguous. Among those who do recognize a system, the evaluation of that system will largely depend upon whether a person is spiritual Christian or instead a materialist leftist. Because there are few, and ever fewer, people who do not inhabit one of these two categories. For the large majority who are materialist leftists, the system is obviously good, overall. For the small minority who are spiritual Christian, the system is obviously evil. I think this is where the original question leads us. I asked whether those who, for instance, support the side of evil in its war against the Fire Nation, are culpable or innocent. And my answer, from a spiritual Christian perspective, is that they are culpable and therefore evil. But they are evilly culpable not in this specific decision, but in their having chosen to affiliate with the system, which is evil. Naturally, such a person will believe whatever the system is telling them, and the more forceful and sustained is the system messaging, the more strongly the system will be believed. But, for someone like myself, if the system is saying anything in a forceful, sustained and coherent fashion, then that thing must be an evil lie, or else the system would not be saying it. A New Creation. William Wildblood. At the end of my last post I mentioned that what Christ offers to those who follow him is a new creation, worth capitalizing I think. I would like to pursue this thought here. It's hardly a new thought but it has relevance in the context of a general spirituality v. Christianity debate which is pertinent in our time. I have written on several occasions about how the teachings and person, because the two are linked, of Christ go further than any other form of spirituality, including those of the Buddha. This idea of a new creation gets to the heart of it. The Buddha saw the reality of suffering and showed a way to escape that. The way involved leaving a fallen creation behind. Basically, it entailed rejecting the goods of creation for entry into the non-created or pre-creation state. We tend to overlook the fact that original Buddhism was a monastic religion. This is a valid response to the evils of this world and or the demands of the spiritual quest, but it is not the only one or even the best one. The best is that offered by Christ, in which matter and spirit or creation and uncreated divine being are joined together to make something new. Here matter is sanctified rather than rejected. Latter forms of Buddhism approach this idea but they never fully embrace it. Other spiritual traditions incorporate elements of this approach but they all have a fundamental drawback. They lack Christ, and it would be my contention that it is only through Christ that one can fully enter the new creation. I firmly believe he is present in other religions to the extent that they are open to his spirit, but he can never be as fully present as he is in Christianity, where he stands revealed as himself. This difference has never been more important than it is today in the context of the world as it is now. That is because we are in the middle of a battle between good and evil. A general spirituality which seeks to rise above the world will either be neutral in the face of this battle, beyond good and evil as those aiming at spiritual transcendence might put it, or else it will be sucked into evil. In fact, as genuine neutrality is no longer possible, if it ever was, they will inevitably be drawn onto the side of evil. Now, if you don't stand against evil, you stand with it, and if you would stand against evil you can only really do that by standing with Christ. Why can't you be good without Christ? because he is goodness. It resides in him as the face and form of God. Other forms might approach or echo that, but he is the living template. If you understand what the good is, you must see it is centered in him, and the more it is separated from him, the less good it is. The new creation came into being when Christ defeated the prince of this world, which is what he did with his life and death. This is why there was no path to it before his time. It didn't exist. This means that any form of spirituality which originated before Christ does not offer a path to it unless, as I say above, that form has opened itself to the Spirit of Christ. This is a controversial position to take in the modern world because the egalitarian dogma has spread into every area of life, including religion. Also, because we in the West reacted to human misinterpretations and distortions of Christianity either by turning to atheism or by seeking spiritual nourishment elsewhere. But go back to Christ himself and the Gospels, particularly that of St. John, and you will discover a spiritual truth that goes beyond all others, one that does not just offer a way out of the material world but purifies that world, so rendering it capable of being lifted up into spirit and becoming something new. A new Adam, a new Jerusalem, a new world. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven, it was this new creation he spoke of. Heaven is not just the oneness of spiritual consciousness. It is that, but it goes beyond that because it brings to that oneness the qualities and colors of creation. And it brings relationship to oneness, which means it brings love. Love existed before Christ, but it did not exist in the same way as it did after him, because he made it possible for the self, hitherto a center of the egotism which could only be escaped from, to be holy. No self means no love. Christ made the individual spiritually beautiful and potentially godlike instead of being a disturbance in the placid waters of divine oneness. Heaven is full of individuals because it is the abode of love, and this was the new creation brought by Christ.